The fire tower stood like a lonely sentinel at the edge of Black Hollow Forest, a rusted structure with creaking metal stairs and a cabin perched high above the treetops. Long abandoned, it hadn't been staffed in years, but locals often glanced up at it from hiking trails below with a strange mix of reverence and unease. Because every evening, just after sunset, a bear cub came. Not just once. Not occasionally. Every single night. The sightings began during the early days of autumn. A hiker had caught a glimpse of something dark and slow-moving on the stairs and thought it was a dog. But when his flashlight caught the round ears and broad paws, he realized what he was looking at. A bear. A young one. At first, people assumed it was passing through. Maybe curious. Maybe seeking shelter from the cold. But then the pattern formed. The same time. The same trail. The same tower. The cub would climb the metal steps slowly, paws clanking against the iron. It would disappear into the small ranger's cabin at the top, and not come back down until dawn. Some nights, it cried. Not in roars or growls, but low mournful sounds that echoed into the dark trees like sorrow bottled inside fur. It didn't try to hurt anyone. It didn't seek food. It didn't wander. It just returned. Over and over. As if waiting for someone. The forest rangers noticed and began monitoring from a distance. One of them, a quiet, observant woman named Cassie, felt a strange pull toward the cub. "There's grief in its body," she told her supervisor one evening. "I know that sounds crazy. But it's not random. It's remembering." Some villagers were skeptical. "It's just a wild animal. They imprint on places," one man scoffed at the cafe. "You're making a ghost story out of a lost bear." But others weren't so sure. A few older locals remembered a man who once lived in that tower, a seasonal ranger who hadn't returned for his last shift the year before. A loner, but kind. He'd taken in wounded birds, fed stray cats. His name was Micah. He'd disappeared after the first snow. No body, no note. Just gone. And now a bear cub came every night to the tower he once called home. Coincidence? Maybe. But when the first snowflakes of the season began to fall again, and the cub made its slow climb up the tower as it always did, people stopped calling it coincidence. They started calling it a vigil. And none of them could look away. The fire tower stood like a lonely sentinel at the edge of Black Hollow Forest, a rusted structure with creaking metal stairs and a cabin perched high above the treetops. Long abandoned, it hadn't been staffed in years, but locals often glanced up at it from hiking trails below with a strange mix of reverence and unease. Because every evening, just after sunset, a bear cub came. Not just once. Not occasionally. Every single night. The sightings began during the early days of autumn. A hiker had caught a glimpse of something dark and slow-moving on the stairs and thought it was a dog. But when his flashlight caught the round ears and broad paws, he realized what he was looking at. A bear. A young one. At first, people assumed it was passing through. Maybe curious. Maybe seeking shelter from the cold. But then the pattern formed. The same time. The same trail. The same tower. The cub would climb the metal steps slowly, paws clanking against the iron. It would disappear into the small ranger's cabin at the top, and not come back down until dawn. Some nights, it cried. Not in roars or growls, but low mournful sounds that echoed into the dark trees like sorrow bottled inside fur. It didn't try to hurt anyone. It didn't seek food. It didn't wander. It just returned. Over and over. As if waiting for someone. The forest rangers noticed and began monitoring from a distance. One of them, a quiet, observant woman named Cassie, felt a strange pull toward the cub. "There's grief in its body," she told her supervisor one evening. "I know that sounds crazy. But it's not random. It's remembering." Some villagers were skeptical. "It's just a wild animal. They imprint on places," one man scoffed at the cafe. "You're making a ghost story out of a lost bear." But others weren't so sure. A few older locals remembered a man who once lived in that tower, a seasonal ranger who hadn't returned for his last shift the year before. A loner, but kind. He'd taken in wounded birds, fed stray cats. His name was Micah. He'd disappeared after the first snow. No body, no note. Just gone. And now a bear cub came every night to the tower he once called home. Coincidence? Maybe. But when the first snowflakes of the season began to fall again, and the cub made its slow climb up the tower as it always did, people stopped calling it coincidence. They started calling it a vigil. And none of them could look away. Cassie, now deeply intrigued, began spending more time near the tower, logging the cub's behavior in a weathered notebook. She noticed something strange. The cub never entered until the sun had fully set. And when it did, it always paused at the base of the final step, the threshold, like it was waiting for permission to cross into something sacred. Once, through binoculars, she saw it place a pine cone carefully at the door before curling up to sleep. Not scavenging. Not wild. Ritual. She closed her notebook that night and whispered to herself. Someone loved this animal. And it loved them back. Micah wasn't the type of man people remembered easily, and maybe that's why the cub remembered him most. He had arrived at Black Hollow a year before the sightings began. A quiet seasonal ranger in his early 40s, Micah had requested the most remote post, the fire tower no one else wanted. It was isolated, hard to reach, and without phone signal for miles. But that's exactly what he needed. What the village didn't know, what Micah never shared, was that he had come to forget. He had once been a wildlife biologist, a father, a husband. But grief had taken all of that. A car accident on an icy road left him the only survivor of a family of 3. After that, the world had become too loud, too full of reminders. So Micah had retreated to the quietest place he could find, the forest, the sky, the watchful silence of the mountains. The fire tower became his new life. He fixed the roof, repaired the shutters, and planted wildflowers at the base of the stairs. He kept notes on weather, fires, and birds, as required, but mostly he listened. Listened to the wind. Listened to the ache in his bones. Listened for anything that might sound like forgiveness. And one day, it came as a cry. A high-pitched, sharp sound echoing through the trees. He heard it from the lookout and climbed down, following it into a thicket where the earth was disturbed, a narrow dirt patch near a fallen tree. That's where he saw it, a tiny bear cub, alone, trembling, one paw bloodied from a snare trap. Its mother was nowhere in sight. Micah knew better than to intervene. It was dangerous. It was unnatural. It was, by park rules, forbidden. But he also knew something else, something deeper and older than protocol. He couldn't leave it. With slow, careful movements, he spoke softly, laid down his jacket, and used the emergency kit to clip the snare. The cub flinched but didn't bite. He wrapped its paw gently, placed it inside a canvas pack lined with flannel, and carried it back to the tower. Micah named the cub Soul. It meant son, he explained aloud one morning, though no one was there to hear him. Because you're the first thing that's warmed this place in a long time. Soul was cautious, but curious. He refused to eat for the first 2 days, then cautiously accepted berries from Micah's hand. At night, he curled up at the foot of the ranger's bedroll, breathing softly, sometimes whimpering in his sleep. Micah read aloud to him, an old journal he kept, filled with notes from the life he left behind. Somehow, it felt right. Soul didn't care about the words. He cared about the voice, the rhythm, the presence. Their bond deepened through shared silences. Micah never tried to tame Soul. He didn't name himself the cub's savior or owner. He just existed beside him. And somehow, that was enough. By the time Soul's paw healed, Micah had built a small ledge bed for him near the window. The cub liked to sit there, watching the valley, as if waiting for something, or someone, to appear on the horizon. Micah stopped counting the days. He stopped waking in tears. The silence no longer crushed him, it cradled him. He often whispered, "It's okay now. You're not alone." But deep down, he knew Soul would one day return to the wild, and he would have to let him go. He just didn't know it would happen so soon. Soul grew quickly, from a trembling cub no bigger than a raccoon into a thick-coated adolescent with clumsy paws and a stubborn streak. But despite his growth, he never strayed far from the tower. Micah didn't try to restrain him. He left the door open each morning, allowing the cub to wander if he chose. And at first, Soul would disappear into the woods for an hour or two, chasing birds or chewing on sticks, only to return before noon, curling up beneath the steps or pawing at the door until Micah let him back in. They had their routines. Every morning, Micah made a pot of oatmeal over the camp stove, sharing spoonfuls with Soul, who preferred his with blueberries. He spoke to the bear like one might speak to a child, gently, without expectation. And though Soul never responded in words, his soft grunts, nuzzles, and head tilts said everything Micah needed to hear. Some evenings, they sat together on the narrow metal landing of the tower, watching the sun bleed orange over the tree line. Micah would play an old harmonica, slow and quiet tunes that echoed into the valley. Soul would rest his chin on Micah's boot, eyes half closed, breathing deep. For Micah, it was healing. For Soul, it was home. Word of the strange companionship traveled quietly through the forest ranger network. A few other rangers came by to see it for themselves, though Micah always asked them to keep their distance. "He's not a pet," he'd say. "He's just here." Cassie, the only one who truly respected that boundary, visited once with binoculars and a thermal camera. She captured a single image, Micah and Soul sitting shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the landing, stars overhead, the valley below. She never published the photo. She kept it in her journal, writing beneath it. Grief made them wild. Love made them stay. Autumn arrived with its flaming trees and brittle wind. Soul's fur thickened. His curiosity grew. One night, Micah awoke to find the cub had climbed halfway up the tower's exterior, exploring, testing boundaries. Another time, Soul brought Micah a gift, a pine cone polished smooth by a river, placed gently on the man's sleeping bag. It was clear, the cub had learned to love him. Micah sometimes talked to Soul about his late wife and son. About the little things, pancakes on Sundays, the toy fox his son never let go of. He never expected understanding. But the bear listened. Always. But even perfect seasons must shift. As the days shortened and the first frost silvered the grass, Micah grew restless. He knew Soul couldn't, stay forever. A bear's place was in the wild. He began training him gently, guiding him deeper into the woods during their walks, showing him where to find berries, how to climb certain trees. Soul obeyed, but always returned, as if tethered by some invisible thread. Micah journaled obsessively those last few weeks. "I'm scared I've taught him how to love a human, but not how to live without one." Still, he didn't stop. He believed that love, even if temporary, was better than loneliness. And every time Soul returned to the fire tower, muddy paws on metal steps, body warm with breath, Micah felt less like a man hiding from the world, and more like one who belonged again. He whispered, "Stay as long as you need." But part of him began to wonder. What would happen when Soul was the one left behind? The first snow came early that year. Micah had woken before dawn, expecting the usual crunch of Soul's paw steps circling the tower. Instead there was silence, the kind that felt too still. Too final. He stepped onto the landing and saw snow dusting the pines like powdered sugar. But no bear. No paw prints. No tracks. No sign of Soul. Micah told himself it was natural, that Soul was finally doing what bears do. Exploring. Testing distance. Becoming wild. Still, something in his chest tightened. He waited all day, kept the door ajar, set out blueberries. But night came. The wind howled. The stairs remained empty. For the first time in months, Micah ate alone. And it kept happening. Day after day. No sign. No noise. No Soul. By the third day, he hiked into the woods, calling softly, checking old paths they used to walk together. But the forest returned only silence. No broken branches. No disturbed brush. It was as if the cub had been swallowed by winter. Micah felt a slow panic setting in. It wasn't just the loss of a companion, it was the return of a terrible echo. The same one he'd felt after the accident that took his family. That aching, hollow space where presence had once lived. He began writing less. Speaking less. Moving slower. He told himself, maybe this is how it was supposed to end. But then came the 6th day. Micah didn't come down from the tower that morning. Or the next. Cassie, who had grown used to weekly check-ins, grew worried. After 3 days of silence on the radio, she hiked up herself. When she arrived, she found the fire tower eerily quiet. The stove was cold. The bed untouched. A bowl of dried oatmeal sat on the counter. And Micah was gone. No note. No trail. No explanation. Only one thing left behind, a pine cone, worn smooth and placed on the windowsill. Just like the one Soul used to bring him. The official search lasted a week. Rangers combed the woods, divers checked the nearby streams. No footprints, no blood, no sign of foul play. Cassie stood at the foot of the tower on the final day, staring up into the fog as snowflakes danced around her boots. "I think he followed him," she whispered. No one responded. Micah Hale was listed as missing, presumed deceased. Locals whispered about it often, some believing he'd wandered off to die peacefully in the woods, others believing something more mysterious had happened. But then, just weeks later, the bear cub returned, climbing the same creaky metal stairs. Every night, as if it had come back too late. And from that moment on, it never missed a night. Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. Micah's disappearance had left a hollow in her chest, but it was the bear's nightly return that unsettled her most. Soul, if it was still Soul, came every evening, climbed the tower in slow methodical steps, and disappeared into the ranger's cabin until morning. Then it would descend and vanish back into the trees. It had become ritual. A silent, aching loop. She watched it for a week from a distance. Then 2. Then a month. Always the same routine. Always alone. But on the 33rd night, she did something she'd never done before. She climbed the tower behind it. Soul didn't notice at first. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. When she reached the top, winded and trembling, she peeked through the frosted glass. What she saw stopped her heart. The bear was curled in the exact place Micah used to sleep. Its massive form filled the space where the sleeping bag still lay, untouched. With one paw, it held a folded flannel shirt, Micah's, pressed to its chest like a child with a blanket. And next to it sat a pine cone. Fresh. Still wet from the stream. Cassie's breath fogged the glass. She pressed her hand to the window. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She descended without a sound. The next morning, she made her way to the ranger's office and requested access to Micah's private journals. At first, they hesitated. Then reluctantly, they handed her a box, mostly water-damaged, smelling of pine and smoke. Inside were dozens of notebooks. Field logs, weather notes, bird drawings. But one was different. Bound in leather, wrapped in string. The cover simply read, "Soul." She opened it slowly. Micah had written nearly every day after rescuing the cub. His words were quiet but deeply personal, reflections on grief, love, and the strange comfort of being needed again. He watches the sunset like he remembers something. Maybe a time before the pain. When he brings me pine cones, I pretend it's nothing. But I keep every one. He's not just healing, he's helping me remember who I was before the silence. Cassie read late into the night, eyes blurring. But one entry caught her breath. It was dated just a week before Micah vanished. Soul disappeared for a full day. I thought he was gone. But when he came back, he had blood on his paw. Not his own. I followed him the next day. He led me to a snare. A deer was caught in it, bleeding out. He showed me. Like he wanted me to fix it. This bear, he's more than instinct. He's empathy. He's memory. He's grief with pause. Cassie's hands trembled. Soul had learned to care. To rescue. To remember. She returned to the tower the next night and left a single pine cone on the bottom step. When Soul arrived, he paused beside it. Sniffed it. Sat down beside it without climbing the stairs. And then looked directly at her, eyes dark, glistening, unreadable. It was as if he understood. That someone else finally saw what he was trying to say. That someone finally listened. A month later, a wildlife filmmaker came to the area, interested in documenting the strange behavior. Cassie refused to help. "This isn't a story for views," she told him. "It's a story of goodbye." Because deep down, she knew the secret. Soul didn't come back every night hoping Micah was alive. He came back because part of Micah still lived there, in scent, in memory, in warmth. And maybe because Soul was the only one who hadn't said goodbye yet. Spring came quietly that year. The snow melted in slow sighs. Buds bloomed like hope, and the trails reopened for hikers who had long avoided the tower's shadow. But something was different. For the first time in months, the bear didn't come. No paw prints in the mud. No midnight creaks on the metal stairs. No shadow curling up beside the empty bedroll. Cassie waited. 1 night. 2. A week. Nothing. She feared the worst. Had Soul finally let go? Or had something happened in the woods no one would ever know? She hiked to the tower again, heart heavy, and climbed slowly. The cabin smelled stale now. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts. The flannel shirt was still there, folded beside the bed. The pine cones still sat in a corner, some beginning to crumble. She sat down, closed her eyes and whispered, "It's okay. You don't have to come back anymore." And maybe the forest heard her. Maybe Soul did too. Because that night, something changed. It was 3 days later when she heard a rustle outside her cabin, miles away from the tower. She opened the door and froze. There, at the edge of the tree-line, stood Soul. But he was not a cub anymore. He had grown into a massive adult bear, thick fur, powerful shoulders, deep eyes. He looked different, and yet exactly the same. In his mouth, gently, he held something small. He stepped forward, placed it down carefully on the porch. A pine cone. Then he looked up at her, not wild, not tame, just present. Cassie knelt down slowly, her eyes welling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. He stared a moment longer, then turned and padded back into the forest without a sound. But before he vanished completely into the trees, he stopped, glanced over his shoulder once, a long knowing look, and then was gone. Years passed. The fire tower was eventually closed off to the public. It became a quiet memorial, a place of reflection. Hikers would sometimes leave pine cones on the steps without really knowing why. They just felt right. Cassie eventually transferred out of the area. But she returned once a year, always in spring, always alone. She would bring a pine cone and place it on the tower steps. Not for Micah. Not for Soul. But for what they meant, a bond unbroken by time or species. One particularly cold April, she returned with a new ranger trainee in tow. He asked, "What's the story with this place?" She smiled softly and said, "It's a love story. The kind you never forget." And as they turned to go, the wind picked up, brushing through the pines like a sigh. From deep within the forest, a faint rustle echoed. Like heavy paws. Like something watching. Still waiting. Still remembering. Because love, real love, never leaves completely. It just finds a place to return to.